episode of the YDWC podcast. Today we'll be covering the conversation of women of colour in the workplace. My name is Mona and I am an analyst, and my ethnic background is Somali. Over to you.
My name's Georgia, I'm a consultant and my background is Jamaican British.
I'm Anahita, I'm an intern in the civil service and my background is Afghan.
I'm Esther, I'm a PR consultant and my background is I'm Nigerian.
I'm Tamika, I'm a software engineer and my background is Ugandan.
I'm Precious, I'm a psychological therapy worker and my background is Nigerian.
Okay, so to start off the conversation, let's throw out and understand what everybody's perspective is on the concept of what a woman of colour is. So any first thoughts that come to your mind and how you identify with it?
I think it's funny because I think I tend to use the term women of colour, but actually when you look at the history of where that terminology has come from, you can debate whether or not we should even be calling ourselves of colour in any way, to be honest, but it's something that I think we still do. I think it kind of comes from that kind of era where you were either white or not, and that's just why it just ended up being of colour. But I think the issue with it is that it kind of creates a monolith, and it kind of creates an idea that all women who are not white have a similar identity or a similar experience, and I don't think that's completely true.
I agree.
I think my experience as a black woman of Jamaican ancestry, heritage, background is different to, say, Anahita's or even Tamika's. But the title Women of Colour doesn't really capture that, so it's an interesting one.
I think it's a broad stroke or just a way of otherizing everyone who isn't white, and then it just reinforces this notion of white being a standard and everybody else is other.
Yeah.
But I think it can be an empowering term as well. It is a broad stroke, and I think there's lots of different experiences within women of colour, but I think we can use it to empower ourselves, because the one thing that does connect us is that we have different experiences from a woman who's white. So I don't think it should be seen in a negative light either. But just considering the complexities of it is important.
I think it's a very regional specific thing. It's a very Western thing. Because I know for me, I wasn't born in this country. I was born in Nigeria. I didn't live there for very long, but even when I came to this country, my culture was very embedded in me. So I was just brought up in that. Because my mum and dad never really fully integrated themselves into British culture. So women of colour was really a term that I started to hear later on in my life. It was always, I was always just brought up to find out what the specific was. So for example, you're Jamaican, you're Somalian, you're Nigerian, Ugandan, that's what I was brought up to find out. So it was never a term of women of colour or just simply black. That was something I noticed. I didn't grow up with referring to everyone as just simply black. It was where are you from,
exactly,
and that's how I would go about it. It was I think maybe because in Africa there isn't being black isn't really, it's not really a thing because everyone is. So it's you have to. It's just about region. So I think for me, I don't really have that much of a connection to the term women of colour, but I do agree that it can be used for really positive things, but again, it is quite broad, and I think when people think of women of colour, they think of black people rather than thinking of Latinos or Asians or Pacific people. There's a lot of people that come under that term woman of colour. So specific is
I think
is
that's
useful.
why I have an issue with it, because there are so many people that fall under it. It's like an umbrella term, and not everybody's issues can get dealt with because everybody's issues are different. But just coining the whole term women of colour, you think, oh yeah, great, we'll just resolve it, but it's not as easy or as simple as that.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I think, like you said, it's quite it can be an empowering term, but the point you made about I've recognised that a lot of people use the term women of colour when they're actually specifically talking about a specific group of women, for example. So it might be they're talking about black women, but then they say, okay, women of colour instead. But then that's an interesting discussion. There's an article on this, and it's actually about, you know, it's that whole thing with like it not being palatable when you directly talk about all black women in a headline. So it's like, okay, let's use the term women of colour. It's more easy to digest. So I think that in itself is an issue. Is like, why can't we just, you know, identify people and just basically allow people to have a platform to talk about their direct experiences, so we're not then just like erasing what people have gone through. Yeah.
To some extent though, I almost think it's intentional, because I don't think we're considered important enough actually individually, and I think it's almost the idea that we're not prepared to give individual groups of different cultural ethnic minorities their own platform. We're going to say you all have to share the same platform because that's what we kind of just think you think you're worth. It's just kind of, you know, us and you, or whoever we're talking about now. I'm confused about. But I mean, like, even when you talk about things like Black History Month, for instance, recently, I've had a few conversations with people about, you know, whether or not we should include Asian figures in Black History Month. And I take issue with it, not because I don't think it's important to celebrate Asian figures, but because I'm thinking there's 12 months in the year. Why should two cultures with completely different backgrounds, histories, that might not even have ever come together at some point in time, share the same month when you could really give them their own month? And it's like, especially in the diversity conversation, I know, and again, this is another level of intersectionality, because it's not to say that women of colour don't sit within the LGBT spectrum as well, but I know that we'll celebrate LGBT history and LGBT kind of pride twice a year, both in February for LGBT plus month, and then again for the whole of July in Pride Month. So for me, these are the kind of things that come about quite recently as well, whereas Black History Month has been around since the early 1900s. So my question is more, why are we so reluctant to kind of create those separate platforms for each different culture, and still kind of trying to create this idea where we all kind of forced to fight over a small kind of platform?
I think it's very like narrative based on that aspect, because I think when you think about it, there's so many different okay, so like the women of colour, there's so many different people that come under that, and I think it's kind of almost a form of laziness, because it's like, okay, so I was having this conversation with my friend. He's of Indian descent, and I grew up with a lot of East Asians as like really close friends, and my experience was always like there were certain things that you just couldn't say to someone of East Asian because it was offensive. Like, for example, referring to an East Asian person as Oriental, I always was brought up knowing that was just offensive and that was not what you should be saying. But then other people are like, well, there's nothing wrong with that. That's just what it's known to be. And it's like they group together and they truncate all of these cultures together a lot, especially when it comes to, you know, people who are of African descent, people who have Asian descent. There's a split between the Asian continent, you know, even to the point where you get some countries that are in Asia but they're not even classified as Asian at all. They're seen as like just simply Arab, or you know, and it's like and then when they, so for example, I have a friend who's Iraqi, and when she says I'm Asian, they're like, oh really, where are you from? And he goes, oh, I'm from Iraq. And they're like, really? Oh, I thought that was Middle East. It's like, what? What? So it's that thing of, there's a lot of miseducation, there's a lot of laziness, and people would rather truncate very different cultures, even though they're geographically quite close. They'd rather truncate very different cultures than be specific. And I think my thing is, being specific is so important, because without being specific, you tend to overlook, ignore, and disregard a lot of cultures instead of really understanding what's going on and the differences. Like, for example, I'm West African, you're East African. Two different cultures. We're in the same continent, but two very different cultures, two very different foods, clothing, music, so many different things. So, but if we go out and we both say we're African, we all get truncated together, and it's different. It's not the same within this similar continent. Now imagine saying now we have now split that between two other continents. So I think it's like it's that idea of being lazy and being and not being specific about things.
Do you think when we talk about women of color, or when you talk about that statement, like you mentioned, it has a historical past, that it's essentially a social construct. It was designed for a specific purpose, and that purpose completely disregarded the nuances that it would have in today's world. So moving forward, however, we can't actually ignore the position that it has in the world today, because how do you then move the conversation forward, and how do you direct it in a way that you are inclusive of all the nuances? Because the reality is there is a white standard experience, and the one thing that all the cultures and the communities and the people experience, what they have in common, is that they do not experience that white standard. So the question that I would like pose to you is, how do we move forward by bringing all those issues to light and giving them the the respect that they deserve and the insight that they need? Like, do we need to then leave that title in the past and figure out a new way, or is it just essentially from now on when we have a conversation just bringing your ethnicity or your experience to the light?
I mean, I think on the diversity front, specifically talking about within the workplace, one thing I will say is that being from Birmingham and then moving to London was a cultural shift in itself. Like, even just outside of where I'm from, like nationality wise, background wise, like there are a lot more Caribbeans in Birmingham than there are when I moved to London, and especially when I moved, obviously going to university, and the university that I went to. And what I experienced was, say within the circles and the spheres like ACS, that was an area that was heavily dominated by Nigerians, heavily. And then that kind of continued into the space of when you now start going to a lot of these kind of diversity events, you do tend to see a lot more of certain people from certain backgrounds in those areas. And that tends to mean that the conversation becomes a bit top heavy, and it starts to reflect more the specific experiences of people from those backgrounds, and it makes it quite difficult for people from other backgrounds to have their voices and their opinions heard. So as much as I think there's a need for, on a wider level, for us to seek a more acceptance for the nuances of our own kind of cultural and ethnic identities, we actually also have to be a little bit kind of more inward looking, or kind of introspective rather, and think about how the diversity systems that we have at the moment actually already might have some levels of, not discrimination, but how they might prioritize the feelings and experiences of a certain group within our own diversity circles.
So can I pose a question? How does that now translate in the workplace? What are your different experiences that you find that maybe hinder or also might be a positive for you in the workplace, and what's your experience in that? So you can talk about whether it's the recruitment phase, progression, finding out the sector that you're interested in, underrepresentation in your sector. So just broadly, what are your experiences? Because I think we are quite diverse in
well, where I currently work, it's heavily populated with people who are of African descent. So I'm actually around a lot of people who are from similar backgrounds for me, a lot of Nigerians. There are some Jamaicans, some Caribbeans. So for me, currently, I don't really feel the that sort of shift of having to acclimate myself to a situation where I'm sort of the only person of colour, if that makes sense. But in previous experiences, for example, I about 3 years ago, I worked at summer camp for about 3 months teaching music in America, and I was the only person of colour on the teaching staff, and I was the only black girl on the teaching staff, and I felt a real shift in tone of how things worked for me, just because there was a lot of separation, there was a lot of distance I felt from just a culture clash, because even though we had international staff that were from Britain, I was the only person from London, and I realised that had a big influence in how I communicate with everyone, because a lot of people who were from England, they were from places like Bristol, Reading, maybe more smaller places where the cultural balance was a bit more tipped to maybe more white people than people of colour. So there was a difference in just taste of music, food, and I sort of felt that alienation because of that. And that was the first time I ever felt that, because I grew up in London, surrounded by people of colour, surrounded by people who aren't of colour but are also surrounded by loads of people of colour, so they understand the culture. It's a little bit easier to mingle together. So I think for me that was the first time that I really felt like, oh, okay, so this isn't it's not just me hearing other people say, I come in and I'm the only black person. I now have actually felt that. So I feel like it is very region based, and for me, luckily I'm in a situation where I'm not feeling that as much, but I know that in psychology, when it comes to recruitment, that is a big factor. And a lot of the times it's difficult for women of colour to progress in recruitment in psychology, because when you get to have assistant psychologist roles, there's a lot of white women and a lot of white men, but there isn't a lot of black women or men, and then there isn't a lot of Asian women or men. So, and there's definitely not a lot of Latino women or men. So I feel like when it comes to psychology, that you find that more in the recruitment side. It's a lot harder for you to get past that if you're a person of colour than if you're not.
Okay. How, just to go around with everybody, how authentic do you feel in the workplace as being your full self? And I want to get insight from that.
I think I'm generally quite comfortable, but then I think that's just my personality anyway, though. Kind of a little bit of a lump it or leave it sort of person, so take me as I am, do you know what I mean? But I found that my workplace has been quite open, and it's been quite a nice place to work inside, the authenticity part. And I think we mentioned it like one of the first podcasts as well, we did that. Sometimes you have to set the precedent. I think if you go into work only really presenting a certain part of yourself, you kind of set a standard that people are going to expect you to continue to do it. Whereas if you kind of go in from the offset being like, yeah, this is me, I'm so professional, but I'm going to do things in this way, and I'm not going to change the way I speak or completely just quash my identity to fit in, then people just generally do start to accept you for you. And I don't think it has to be to the detriment of your career at all.
Okay. Your experience?
I think it's actually been, I've only started working I've been working for 3 months now, and I think it's been kind of difficult for me to adapt to the workplace, because throughout my life up until now, I've always been around people of colour, and not been around white people that much. And now that I am in a very white dominated workplace, I find that I think it's not about being a woman of colour, it's about being a person of colour. I find that myself and my colleagues, who are very few people, there are very few people of colour, we can't make certain jokes, like things that I'm used to normally. We can't make certain jokes, we can't talk about race issues, for example. Like, we feel uncomfortable talking about issues like that when there are white people around, but when it's just us, it's a lot easier for us to talk about those kinds of things. And I found it, I think it's like a big cultural shift for me. I definitely don't feel like I can fully be myself in the workplace. And you're right, it is about confidence and like having the confidence to express yourself, but I think even if I did that, it would make people around me uncomfortable.
No, I won't lie. I wouldn't say that anyone could do it, because the workplace that I work in now is very different to the first place that I worked before. And the first place that I worked before was it was an engineering firm, and it was mainly white, middle-aged men. And I was quiet, spent a lot of the day sitting in the toilet just to get away from the rest of the office, because I just felt that suffocated by it all. But I think sometimes it does definitely depend on the sort of environment you work in, but when you're in an environment you really just feel like you want to underplay the fact that you are a different race, because you don't want people, you almost feel like it's a nuisance to other people to have to kind of make allowances or tolerate. You just feel very uncomfortable in those sort of environments.
I think it's really implicit. It's not something that's expressed by people, and there are people of colour where I work. It's not that there aren't, but I think we all have the general feeling that we have to tone ourselves down to an extent.
Yeah.
And
I was gonna say, like, similar to what Georgia said. I think for me, I work in like the PR industry, and it's mainly white. I mean, you'll be lucky if you see 2 black people on one, like as client handlers. I think that plays into the fact that I mainly do corporate PR, but it's the same thing across. I've heard from different people. But I think first of all, I think one of the key issues with being yourself is that, like, because you're a junior person, I've only been working for 2 years, I can only do that to a certain extent, and there's a certain type of culture basically. I mean, those offices, it's very like, you know, drinks heavy, it's very laugh at jokes whether they're offensive or not, and it's like if you don't, then you're not being seen as a team player. And I'd been called out for stuff like that, so it was almost like you basically realise you either adapt, which is what I've been told by people, literally like, no, you just have to get on with it and adapt to it, but it's like, this is not who I am. So it was that constant battle of, this is not who I am, and it's detrimental to like my well-being, my mental health basically, because I'm basically having to be someone else. But at the same time, it's like I also want to have my job as well and also grow. But I think mainly on that industry, I think one of the key issues is like is PR is basically mainly based on referrals. So even though it's like recruitment and stuff like that, a lot of it is actually, oh, I know somebody that's really good for the job, why don't you bring them in? The problem is the majority of my industry is basically white and middle class and male. So obviously the people that they do bring in come from a certain background. So I've noticed that like when people do bring in their friends and stuff like that, again, they're not people of colour. The only time they really do get a reference from someone as a person of colour, someone like me, for example, because again, I grew up in London, so most people I know are people of colour. So I think recruitment has a huge role to play in that. And like you said, people aren't explicit. They won't come to you and say, oh, sorry, you can't have your hair looking like that and you can't do this. So the problem is that you don't get to actually, you know what they're trying to imply, but they're not going to say it, because again, I think is when you're so used to things being a certain way and you are the default of society, you don't even realise you're just like, oh, that's not professional. But when it's like, but why is it not professional? What do you mean by that? People aren't going to say that, do you know what I mean? So I think for me, I think that has played a role in me being myself. Is I think when you hear the jokes and like the music and like, we're going to do this tonight, and in my head I'm like, oh, I don't really like do this. But then it's you almost start, like you don't realise, but you almost try and adapt to your environment, and at that stage I think for me you just like leave. But yeah.
Okay, so moving on to like another topic that I think was a good segue is how important is networking in your different professions, and how do you think being a quote unquote woman of colour impacts that? So you've just mentioned that. I think there was a stat that I saw the other week that 70% of professions across the board are from people who come from private schools, and the majority of the demographic in private schools are people who are from wealthy backgrounds and who are predominantly white. And how does networking in that space, when you don't come from that background, how does that impact you? And also tie that in being your authentic self, because I think that's important if you're going to make a connection.
Okay, so I don't want this to be like a silent plug, but networking, YDWC has really helped me.
That's why you're a That's a brand ambassador there.
But jokes aside, let me. Oh, we were laughing too loud. But yeah, jokes aside, let me be really honest. So for before I moved into the role that I'm in now, I was working in the NHS. And I think the NHS already in itself is very multicultural. So I was used to working with people from different backgrounds, different ages, and people that shared different histories. Some people of colour, some people that weren't. But it was very multicultural and diverse, and that's all I had experienced in my life up until that point. Now, when I made the switch to go to a more corporate environment, it was at that point that I actually realised, wow, this is what people were talking about when you sort of enter a different workforce and nobody looks like you. And almost to the point where when you see someone that looks like you, there's this bonding experience where you sort of give them a nod and a wave, like, oh yeah, you made it here too, great. And in a sense, so for a long time I felt like an other, and I don't feel like anybody made me feel that way. It's just I, in myself, felt like I had nothing in common with these people. The schools they went to, I didn't. The food they were eating, I can't have a sandwich for dinner. I don't eat cold food. Like, just like that. I'm not generalising and I'm not trying to be racist, but I'll come with stew, and there's this thing in Uganda, like kawunga. I'll come with kawunga and beans, and I'll be there eating with my hands. I'll be like, oh, what's that? Anyways, So sometimes, and they'd all like want to go for lunch together. And for me, I was just like, I'd rather be by myself because it's so draining to be around you. Because the conversations you guys are talking about, I don't care. Like there was one point where some lady was talking about her cats, and that's fine. I don't have pets because my mum was just like, you can't have any. That's a separate issue. But it wasn't until I went to the first YDWC meeting that I was like, oh my goodness, there are people who are having this shared experience. I can talk about it. I can be my authentic self. And it was like, you actually got it, because there were like, where I grew up, not everybody went to university. Everybody took different life paths and choices. So I couldn't have that conversation with all of my friends. Some of them I could, but it was just nice to see it from a professional standpoint. So, I mean, and it really opened my eyes up into the importance of networking, because I think like people say all the time, like your network is your net worth. And it wasn't until working in a bank that I actually realised that one of my managers had only had one interview in his life. Every other job that he's got, and he's been in the industry for 40 years, every other job that he got was from a friend or from a friend's friend. And I was just like, oh, that would be nice not having to do an interview again. I need to network. So yeah, it's important to answer your question.
That's a fantastic segue to the next topic as well. I think the topic about having sponsors in the workplace. So just a quick, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, so a sponsor, those who are familiar with the term of a mentor, for example, is a mentor is someone that you would go to for advice, that has experience in the field that you are interested in, and that you can go to, whether it's informally or formally, to get a different perspective and to almost help you. Whereas a sponsor is that person who, when you aren't in the room, when there are opportunities for progression, who back you and who push you in front of others who may not have had exposure to you. So they're essentially your backers. So how important is it in these so if you've just said the person that your manager has only applied for one job and everything has been a referral from that point onwards, and obviously he's progressed quite well, and we're also in an environment when most of the people who you're going to be communicating with, the people who have the positions of power, the people who have influence, aren't going to be from your background, then how detrimental is that to you? Do you need someone who shares your experience, who is a woman of colour or from an ethnic background or diverse, to be your sponsor, versus someone who isn't? And how, because you have to be, I think it's very important to note that you have to be your authentic self to be your best self. And to be your best self, you need to be comfortable with the person who is going to be your sponsor and back you. So I want to open the floor for that question.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm still looking for a mentor, but initially when I started my pursuits, I thought that my mentor had to be a vision of me. So I was looking for a woman of colour in a tech sort of orientated business, and who was a developer. And it was upon looking that I realised that there aren't that many. So I was like, okay, maybe I should broaden my search. But then I spoke to my manager, and it was at that point that I realised that your mentor or sponsor doesn't have to be like you. They just have to appreciate your role, and be able to offer something. So where it's be advice or whatever. And also the fact that you can have different mentors for different things. You can have a professional mentor, you can have a religious mentor. So with that being said, I realised that I could have a sponsor in someone who, anybody in a position where I respected and saw myself going. And carry on. I don't know where I was going with this. Anyways,
I was just gonna say, essentially what you're saying is that person, you should have a variety of mentors, essentially.
Yeah.
And the variety of mentors and also sponsors don't actually have to be a vision of yourself.
Yeah.
Because
then you sort of pigeonhole yourself in that sense, that you're just looking for someone that's like you, when really anybody that sees your work, your effort, and how much merit you have can be your advocate.
Yeah, I would say that I think within the place that I work right now, I've been quite lucky, because we do a reverse mentoring scheme that's actually worked very well for me. And me and my reverse mentor have a really good relationship, and he's actually the person who helped me to get a promotion and a job without an interview. So I've seen how that can literally work. But in addition to that, in terms of actual sponsors, I think the approach I've taken is to try and make every senior person that I work with my sponsor in some way, shape or form. try to kind of build a relationship with them. It's a form of networking, but it's also kind of demonstrating the skills, being good at what you do, and also being very personable as well. Because I think before I entered the workplace, I thought I was quite pedantic. I thought everything was about what you would be able to achieve academically, what you did just professionally, just in terms of your deliverables. But so much of your development as a professional is founded on the relationships that you can make with the people that you're working with, and whether or not people actually enjoy working with you, want to work with you, and all those sorts of things. Like in the workplace, I think I do quite love diversity stuff anyway, so I've never completely felt I can't talk about it because I'm the office champion for diversity. So even if I'm not going to be talking about diversity when I'm talking to people, you'll know that it's something I'm interested in, something that I'm going to campaign for. But I think being able to, like I said, build those relationships with people, to kind of create those sponsor environments is really, really important in terms of your progression, because of the times when you just need numbers of people to kind of back your case. And that's why it's important not just to look for one or two, but to make it your kind of ambition, to make sure that you are genuinely developing relationships with people who can help you and who are going to want to help you when the time comes.
Okay. Anita, any thoughts on?
Not on having a sponsor per se. That's not something that I've thought about much, but I think if I was looking for a sponsor, or when there's people that I look up to, it tends to be people who have the same background as me. Like, I find it very, very difficult to aspire to someone who has had a completely different experience from me. So I wouldn't really want to have a sponsor who is like white, male, middle class, whatever, because I just don't think that they haven't had the same experiences as me. So how can I aspire to what they're doing when their path to get there has been completely different from mine?
But just because they don't understand it doesn't mean that they can't appreciate it. You don't have to go through something yourself to then empathize or help or see that there's a need for diversity.
I'm not saying that they can't. I'm saying I find it difficult to aspire to them, to what they are or where they are, because I don't know. I just think that they haven't had this similar struggles that I have. So yeah.
I don't know. I think sometimes you tend to think that you can judge whether or not someone's had similar experiences to you on face value, and it's not always the case. Like I've genuinely been surprised by the sorts of people that I've met at work that I've got along with, or I felt like we've connected, and on face value I would never have thought we would have done, just because they might have been middle-aged, middle-class white men who'd gone to private schools or were raised, expat lifestyles and all those sorts of things. I was thinking, there's no way we're going to be able to connect or get along. But then after a while you do manage to find a way to kind of build that rapport with people, and just kind of perhaps find how you can create connections at kind of like a deep level, perhaps more intrinsic things than the things that you just see on the face value, whether or not they're the same race or gender or from the same place.
Okay. Esther, do you have any thoughts?
No, I think everyone said everything. I think I actually get what you mean. I totally understand. Like, I think the only issue with that is obviously when you're in a workplace, you realise quite immediately that basically there's like, even if I did want to find someone that was from the same background, there's basically none.
Yeah.
So,
same.
But I totally understand what you mean about because I'm a carer for my brother. So one issue I always used to have with people was that you have to get out for drinks, blah blah blah, and I was like, well, no, because you see a young 24-year-old, but I'm not a young 24-year-old to you. I'm literally probably like a 40-year-old looking after my family. So I don't. Explaining that to somebody that's your sponsor, who, for example, in that environment, literally going for drinks like every day would literally be the key to you basically getting a promotion. I've seen it several times. But for me, it was about actually finding someone that could actually be like, wait a minute, how can I help you? So the next person I was with was like, actually, why don't you do something more personalized? Why don't you go out for dinners? You love food. Why don't you find different stuff to do? And it was about just finding somebody that was able to appreciate and understand what my life was, and basically see how they could help me in that way, rather than be like, well, this is the key to how you do it here, so you just have to fit in with it or not. So I totally get what you mean by that. But like you said, you'll be surprised by people. I mean, like, you see people at face value, but you don't realise they have other sorts of experiences. But when it comes to choosing a mentor sponsor, for me, is more about, I'm not there to, I mean, if we build a friendship, that's great, but that's not in the workplace. It's more about what do you have that I aspire to. Maybe it's a work ethic they've got or something like that, and I'm like, damn, I really need to like get that on. Or is the way that they prepare themselves, or is the way they bring a different perspective, is like, how do they do that? I want to learn that. And I try and just like look at people like that and be like, actually no, I want to learn that from you, rather than from more of a personal perspective sometimes. Yeah.
And just to be a bit, I don't know, controversial, or to play a devil's advocate, what are your thoughts in if you say, you know what, I am the only person of X in this environment, therefore I don't connect with anybody, therefore I don't have any mentors or sponsors, I can't really put myself out there, because the reality is we are in a country where we are a minority. You can't walk into a space and expect the majority, or you know, I think sometimes when we're in London, we assume because London is so ethnically diverse that the professional space is going to be the same. But when you walk into the professional world, it's not just Londoners who are in the room, and it can actually reflect how the country looks like. So if you're in a room of 10 people and ethnic minorities are 10 or 20% of the population, having 1 or 2 people out of a room of 10 who are ethnic is actually a fair reflection. So if we go in demanding even more and more people, the reality is it might not actually filter through. So what do we then do to make sure that we aren't just demanding others to be inclusive of us, but make sure that we also adapt ourselves as well? And that topic of adaptability, and where do we go from, how do we, yeah, I'm just interested in your thoughts. Just play like a devil's advocate.
I don't know. I think there's different sides to it really, because it depends. Like, I know you said the demographic side of things, and expecting more than 1 in 10 wouldn't be reflective of the demographic. But then I think you might be able to kind of filter it down a little bit more than that, to be fair. Because if you actually started looking at certain other sorts of demographics, so for instance, if you did look at the percentage of women of colour in universities, there are, by percentage, probably more women of colour in university than you tend to get in professional worlds anyway. So it just depends on which demographic you're actually looking at. I know that wasn't your main point, but just to make that clear, that I think sometimes the idea that, there's only, 13% of the population is BAME 17, something like that. I think that's tended to be used as a bit of a scapegoat sometimes, to say that's why we can't do better or can't do more. When actually, when you perhaps look at it in different ways, I don't think it's always that. It's not the most relevant statistic or relevant metric to measure how well you're doing in the diversity space. But then, yeah, I think adapting is important, but I just don't think you should have to compromise yourself too much, to be honest with you. I think I really do stand by the idea that I think if you go into the workplace and you're able to kind of be your true authentic self, sometimes people respect that a lot more than if they feel like you're just being, just sucking up to them or just acquiescing at times. Like, if you just genuinely go in, this is me, this is who I am, I'm going to be professional, I'm going to do the best that I can do and be, but I'm going to show you that I don't have to be the black person who pretends to be white to do well. It's important, and it's very helpful for the people who come after you, because I think when you do go into a workplace, and in order for you to feel like you're able to get promotions or to progress in the ways that you want to, you start diluting your blackness or diluting kind of where you're coming from on another ethnic side of things. They expect everybody else who comes into the business looking like you to do the same thing too, and it kind of just perpetuates and exacerbates the issue. Whereas if you kind of go in saying, you know what, I'm going to have the courage just to be my authentic self and still do well at my job, I think there's definitely a chance people will respect you for that, and that you will still be able to make the headway that you want to.
Yeah, but I agree. But I do find that, it's true what you said, but I just find it highly frustrating, because it's almost like there's a laziness, I think, when it comes to diversity. For me, I keep saying this, but for London, for example, my industry is concentrated in literally central London, basically. And what I find really confusing is that you cannot tell me that you cannot find different forms of diversity in London. You've got to be kidding me. It's laziness, period. I mean, if we look at the recruitment, for example, it's just simple things like the Taylor Bennett Foundation is literally what helped me to basically get into it. And what they targeted was, number one, the traineeship was actually paid for, which meant that we weren't doing free internships. That's a key reason why there's hardly anybody that is from any other, where people from working class backgrounds hardly are in my industry, because they can't afford unpaid internships. The same thing with journalism as well. You've also got things like, are you going to universities? Are you going to schools that aren't, sorry, I was going to say Ivy League. That aren't Russell Group universities. You're literally going to the same university. It's like, oh, we can't find any diversity. Oh my gosh, I wonder why. It's actually not difficult. Some of these issues is just because a lot of people when I grew up in London, I did not even know my industry existed. All I knew was investment banking, or be an actor, or be a football player. And I just wasn't good at any of those things. But it's just that whole thing with, I think, is the lack of laziness on the side of the people that do have the power. But my issue with being a person of colour in the workplace, I think a lot of people, and I've heard this a lot, feel the pressure of having to be the representative for their race. And I really hate that, because it's like, the same way I walk into a workplace and I see a white woman, I wouldn't go, oh my gosh, that white woman's awful, so that means everyone's like that. No, it's more, I'll just be like, so-and-so is just not a nice person. But the next day I see someone else, I'm like, oh, okay, that person's lovely. It was a personality thing. So I think it's that thing of having to make the sacrifice of you being authentic that will manifest itself its way in different ways, basically, because in some places sucking up is literally the way you get up. So if you don't adapt and you decide to be yourself, that will have a certain effect on your mental health. So it's like, even though that is the thing to do to survive, and it'll be good for other people coming in, it's almost like, why it's just not right that we should have to make such an insane sacrifice. And I know that's not what George is saying, but I'm just saying that it's such a harsh reality that we have to face, and be like, oh, I can't do this because they're going to think all black people are like this, and I'm the only like black person in this company, and I have to seat up for all the black people here. And it's just like, I just personally don't see my white colleagues having to deal with that. I think they just think, oh snap, that was a really like crap thing for me to do. It's just personal. It's an individual, but for us it's like, oh my gosh, what if they don't take the rest of my people? And it's just it's just, I think it's laziness to some extent.
I'm gonna have to disagree with the idea of laziness. I think it's just they don't care. I don't think it's lazy. They don't have to care. They don't care. I think people. I think it's not about laziness, because when you're recruiting, inherently you can't really be lazy, because you're trying to look for the best of the best. I think the situation is that it's an institutionalized racism where people of color aren't always in an abundance of influence. There's not a lot of people of color in Russell Group unis, where it's a real big pool. And even if the pool is quite significant, they will probably feel like, we don't want to have too many of a certain type of people in our workplace. Because I think it's also about, there's this thing called like workplace culture, and I think that's just a veiled way of saying we don't want too many people of colour in our workplace. Because what's a workplace culture? A workplace culture should be, you get in, you do your job efficiently, and then you leave. You get along with people. That's the workplace culture. Workplace culture shouldn't be about what kind of hair you have, what kind of school you went to. It's about, can you do the job, and can you be a decent human being while also doing the job? That is an efficient workplace culture. But workplace culture is then used as a way to disregard a huge amount of people out of the job, because it's like, okay, if you don't come out to drink with us, okay, but what if I'm Muslim and I don't drink? If you don't come, if you can't come and do this with us, or come and all these things that it's lined up to be associated with a specific culture. That's discrimination. That's not being lazy. That's just, we don't care about your culture. We want you to apply yourself to our culture. And because especially in corporate industries, that's what I've seen. Because it's not like, there are some places that are a bit more like, okay, let's try and be accommodating to all the different types of cultures around. But if that person is having to sacrifice a part of their culture that has nothing to do with their efficiency of work, that's discriminatory. That's not. Do you know what I mean?
No, I think I agree. I think my perspective is that I find that in terms of, when the terms are used, fit, culture.
Team fit.
Team, we want
Yeah.
someone who, it's just, it's
What does
essentially
that
using
mean?
that word fit.
Yeah.
And I always go back to the concept of where there's ambiguity, there's always something rotten beneath it.
Yeah.
When people want to be honest, and when there's a clear, the corporate world is a world that's based on numbers, figures, outcomes, and it's driven, and that's essentially what it's driven by. But it's funny how the environment that you're in is also dictated by how you fit all these ambiguous terms. And I think the funny thing is, if you there's recent research done by the Behavioral Insights team, and they looked at what actually helped those people who come from whether it's gender, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's social class, what helps them actually progress and be successful in the workplace. And it's transparency, structure, shortlisting the equal amount of people. So when you go into the interview room, you already have shortlisted equal amount of those who are being interviewed. Having a structured interview process, so that's like the recruiting stage. Once you're in the environment, there has to be transparency in terms of progression, transparency in terms of like the salary ranges, transparency in terms of how to then maneuver yourself, and having like a fair review process. And the interesting thing is, can we say that at the current time, the corporate world, does it reflect that when a corporate company has to be transparent? If they're like publicly listed, they will have an annual report that is so transparent in terms of how much money that they're spending, their budgets, their profits. However, they're not transparent when it comes to who is going to get the promotion, who gets to work, and who's the person that gets to the interview stage, who's the person who has influence past when the review process from those who are in that the team who are making the decision who gets hired. So I think my takeaway has been that the reality is it isn't transparent. It's there is this sort of resistance to be, because the reality is, once you do have the figures, when you do have the transparency, when you do see the structure, it will be skewed against you. But we are working in, my experience anyway, we're working in a corporate world which bands on about efficiency, bands on about being effective, and that's the one place that I find it to be ineffective.
I mean, I definitely agree that those things are what are most important, but I cannot underplay the importance and the level of significance that building those relationships definitely has. And it's not just for the sake of networking, it's also kind of for the sake of kind of understanding and cultural knowledge exchange and insight as well. Like last week, one of my senior managers at work said that he had 2 free tickets to go and see the rugby, so like England versus South Africa. I've never been to a rugby game in my life, never watched rugby at all, but I was like, okay, it's free, let's go and see the experience. I have never seen so many middle class white men in my life walking into that stadium. I was honestly overwhelmed, and it was only when that happened I was like, wow, you start to really feel the magnitude of what you are trying to change. You really start to feel the magnitude of what you're trying to change, and it is a lot. And I don't think it's the sort of thing that you can change by asking for it to be changed, to be honest with you. And as much as I think companies have to kind of be more transparent, I feel like somewhere, somehow, people from both working class backgrounds as well, this is both a race and ethnicity issue, and it is also a class issue as well. But the approach that we're taking, in order to really get the results that we want, we're going to have to change it, because I don't think it's the sort of thing that you get by knocking on doors. Like, I know there's been this video that's been circulating of this guy, is his name Reggie, the one that was knocking on people's doors around Chelsea. Good on him, but I really do not like the way that the story's been pushed everywhere, because it kind of makes it feel like if you, as someone from an ethnic minority, wants to succeed, you have to be walking around knocking on people's door like you're selling something. And I don't agree with it, because it's like, really, those sort of frameworks should be put there by our government, by our schooling system, by those kind of professional institutes. I don't think it's a case that you should make it the onus of the person of colour to have to go around knocking on doors to get what they want.
I think there should be more interconnectivity as well, because I feel like a great example is how the Jewish community run things. the Jewish community are so interconnected in every aspect of their life, and I've seen it. I have some really good friends who are Jewish, and I've seen how they connect themselves when it comes to personal things, professional things, getting jobs, referrals. It's literally their own community, like their own world, and they go about it in that way. They see that, and that's how they situate things. And I think people of color, from whether you're Asian or you're black, or we need to implement that sort of strategy, because that's the best way that we're going to be able to do it. It's not, as Georgia said, it's not always about expecting the majority to change things for the minority. We as a minority need to take that and try and make our own things and watch it grow. Obviously it's difficult because there's things that are making it more difficult as it goes on, but that's something that we do really need to try.
And that's a good segue into, I think I want to go around asking everybody, what's the piece of advice that you would give to somebody who's a woman, quote unquote, of colour, who's now entering the workplace and the workforce, and something that they can take away? So,
I'm going to say, from my very short experience of starting work and having to tone myself down and adapt to what other people expect of me, I think what's important is to be uncompromising in who you are. Don't tone yourself down. There's something that I'm realising in the last few weeks. I don't need to be what other people expect me to be, and I don't think anyone should. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, on that, it's like a similar thing is, don't tone yourself down, because you can't for a long time anyways. But also as well, is even if you are the minority in your workplace, is also remembering that it's not just about fitting into their culture, but realizing that you actually have something to bring. Whether that is, I mean, as a Nigerian, when we have clients that are Nigerian and they say certain stuff, I'm like, oh, you can't say that, but to me it's common sense, or I'm like, oh, this. And immediately I just realized, actually, I bring something different. I bring a different experience. I bring a different perspective. I think sometimes that can be killed when you're overwhelmed by the fact that you're literally the only one. But it's always remembering that you have something that they don't have, that anyone else in that room doesn't have, whether that's your personality or that's your knowledge or your experience. And no matter how many books you read, no one can take that away from you. So don't forget that you have something to bring to the table.
I think my point is just remembering that you're there for a reason. So you've got the job because you're capable of doing it, and now that you have it, just excel. And the best way you can excel is just by being yourself. I know it's very cheesy, but it's also very true.
I would say remember to always just put yourself out there, because I think sometimes if you're in a situation where you are surrounded with people who are different to you and you're feeling very I guess for lack of a better term, claustrophobic, remember to just push through and put yourself out there. I think for me that's something that I learned in my experience, that I closed up, and that's the worst thing to do, because when you close up, they almost use that as a reason to blame you for why that's not working. Just literally push through and put yourself out there and say, this is me, this is how it's going to be, and be proud in that, because at the end of the day, you're a human being, you've worked hard to get to where you are, and if you're not there yet, you will get there. So be positive.
I think my piece of advice would be, yes, be unapologetically yourself. And I also honestly do believe in adapting, but adapting doesn't mean assimilating. So essentially, you wouldn't wear a suit to if you wanted to be a bartender. So just taking that into perspective and adapting to the environment you're in. But when you do that, do not compromise yourself and still be authentically yourself, because you can only be your best self if you want to succeed.
I would say dream big, and don't feel like because you're the only person like you in that environment that it doesn't mean that you can't be the best person in that environment. I think there's Simone Biles, the gymnast, who recently she's not the first black person or the first woman who's a black person or the first person. She's the first American to win, I think it is a medal at every world championship, I think, something like that. And it's the same about Serena Williams as well. And it's this idea that you can be the best in general, not just the best subcategorized. So really it's about honing a skill to the point that you become irreplaceable, to the point that no one else can be better than you at that, and use that to your advantage and leverage it to get what you want.
Come true.